Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose at the Wharf. I'm Brad Graham, co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine. We're delighted to be hosting Yoni Appelbaum, who's here to talk about his new book, Stuck: How the Privileged and the Property Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. Yoni's deputy executive editor of the Atlantic magazine and a social and cultural historian of the United States. Before joining the Atlantic, he was a lecturer on history and literature at Harvard University. And before that, he taught at Babson and Brandeis, where he received his PhD in American history. Stuck is his first book, and it begins with the premise that the ability Americans long enjoyed to move to new places where there were job opportunities was a key to the country's economic and social development. But that mobility, as Yoni explains, has been eroded. Every year, he writes, fewer Americans can afford to live where they want to. Yoni examines the reasons for this and goes on to argue the growing lack of mobility for Americans isn't just a housing market problem, it's a threat, he asserts, to American democracy because it's giving rise to a sense of people being stuck in place, and it's deepening political divisions in our country. Yoni deftly and engagingly makes his case by drawing not only on lots of data and the work of historians, sociologists, and economists, but also on individual stories gathered from his own reporting around the country. This book hopefully will get us thinking more clearly about the current mobility crisis and debating possible solutions more productively. And some potential solutions are discussed in Yoni's final chapter. Now, a conversation with Yoni will be his boss, Jeffrey Goldberg, who is the Atlantic's editor-in-chief and also can be seen each week moderating the PBS show Washington Week with the Atlantic. Now, here's the thing about working for Jeff and writing a book. Either he shows up to watch your book talk, which he did last week for one of his other staff members, or he steps up to moderate the event, like he's doing this evening. Either way, that's dedication. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Yoni Appelbaum and Jeff Goldberg.
Hi, thank you for coming. We couldn't hear a word you said, by the way. I'm sure it was very, very nice, though. Nice to see all of you here. Some staff. Actually, a lot of people at the Atlantic work directly for Yoni, so this is a performance of dedication. I think. But Yoni, we're glad to do this, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions from the audience. I know Mark Leibovich has 9 questions himself. And I just want to start by saying a word about Yoni and about books by staff generally. There's a thing that happens when you have somebody, a colleague, or somebody who works with you, and they write a book. You before they hand you the manuscript or the draft, there's a special prayer, and it's dear God, please don't put me in a position where I have to lie to the author and say that this book is good when it's actually not good. It never happens at the Atlantic because everybody at the Atlantic is above average and writes fantastic books. And I have to say, in particular, the subject matter of Yoni's book is not in my top tier of interests, and so I had that particular anxiety that I was going to start reading this, and I was going to find it to be a challenge to my ADD brain. The amazing thing was that it's actually gripping. It's from the first words. So if you haven't read it already, I really suggest it. It's very, very hard to, as journalists in the room know, it's very, very hard to write narrative, even about war and catastrophe. It's harder to write narrative about slow-moving social forces. And that's what Yoni is dealing with, but this is absolutely fascinating, gripping book. I just wrote your blurb. That's good. I'll just write it on the cover. Yeah, gripping, says Yoni's boss. Let me start by asking you what, I mean, you've been thinking about this since you were an academic. You've been thinking about these subjects. What was the original impulse that got you involved?
Right, I think you nailed it. I wanted to tell a strong narrative, and there was no better subject than zoning. Zoning.
Yeah.
What's coming on over there. No, I was living a decade ago in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was the city where I was born, the city I love. And I was in an apartment that was like a little too small for my family. It cost us more than we could actually afford to pay. And as a historian, I knew something about the neighborhood I was living in. I knew it was actually a pretty special place. That Cambridgeport, I think often the image of Cambridge is like it's a university town. A little bit of it was a university town. Cambridge was the industrial city across the river from Boston. It was a gritty blue-collar town. And it was filled with 3-story wooden buildings, these triple-deckers, that filled with the children of immigrants who would come to the city to find good jobs in the candy industry. That's what was in Cambridge. And they would make things like junior mints, which are still made in Cambridge and walked by the factory at Salisbury. And they lifted themselves and their families up. And then a new wave of migrants and immigrants would show up in Cambridge and do the same thing. And this happened so often that the sociologists who studied it coined a new term just to describe this neighborhood. They called it a zone of emergence. By the time I lived in Cambridge, it was not a zone of emergence. It was a professional class neighborhood. And that was a pretty profound change. Lots of neighborhoods change, right? There's no guarantee that the place you live will always look like that. But all across America, you could find a zone of emergence in any city you went to 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And today you will find precious few. There are very few places in America where new arrivals can find an affordable place to live and build a better life for themselves and their family. And I wanted to know what the hell had gone wrong. And that is what set me off on the journey to produce this book.
I had no idea about junior mints, by the way. I feel like I've learned something new right now.
Well, when they were in production, like you'd step out the front door and the whole neighborhood smelled like chocolate and mint.
That's not bad. So is it that success begets failure? Is that inevitable in the way these neighborhoods change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this was the weirdest thing, was that for a couple hundred years, America opens the door to mobility, and that's not what happens. I think today many of us look around and we're like, well, of course I can't live in a nice neighborhood, of course I can't move to a city with a lot of opportunity, that's for rich people. That's not how it was. So this is a country which invents the right to live where you want. I mean that quite literally, like they invent this right. It's not something we have even at the founding of the American Republic, right? In the colonial era, if you wanted to move into a town, you needed the permission of the town. If they didn't want you there, they would warn you out, they would deliver a written notice that said you have 2 weeks to vacate, and if you didn't get out of that town, the town sergeant had the right to bind you up and put you in a cart and drive you back to the town that you came from, because you were attached to the community in which you were born until you died, unless another community accepted you. That community could be billed for your care. If another community convicted you of committing a crime, they could take you back to the place where you were from. You belonged to a place, you were attached to a place, and you had no legal right to just decide you wanted to live someplace else. And around 1800, we make a series of legal changes in this country which say, no, you can be the agent of your own destiny. You've got the right to go where you want, and you can become the resident of a place just by showing up and saying, I intend to be a resident of this place, and that was my plan for you.
Could you pause on that and just open that up a little bit? What happened in 1800, and who were the motivating forces in that non-obvious at the time innovation?
Yeah, it happens for the first time, I think, as best I can trace it, in Ohio, right? So we're opening new territories just as fast as we can displace their rightful owners. And settlers are going out to the frontier. And these new territories are competing for population. And if you fence off your frontier town and say, look, you gotta pass muster before you move in here, we're not sure we really want you, people will go to the next frontier town. And they'll go to the next territory. So Ohio is worried about Indiana, and it's worried about Illinois. It's worried that people are gonna go to other places instead if it gives its communities the power to select their own members. And so the courts and the legislature combine to take that right away from local communities. And once Ohio does it, we often talk about races to the bottom. This one is a race in a positive direction. It's a race toward freedom. Other territories and then the existing states similarly free their people to move toward opportunity because they're also competing for population. The fundamental belief of Americans in the 19th century is that growth is good, that it will bring collective benefits, and that you want your community to keep growing. And so once one place does it, everybody follows suit.
I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far, but when did this Ohio innovation move east and not west? I have to imagine that Massachusetts was not enamored of this idea when they first heard of it from the frontier.
No, they're not thrilled about it, but it's changing even.
They might not be thrilled about it today, in fact.
They're not thrilled about it today, and we'll get there. But as this comes back, there are already changes taking place in the East where industrial towns are competing for population, right? And so the system of warning out is crumbling. And as these legal changes ripple backward, they sort of sweep away the last vestiges of this old system where you needed permission to live someplace. By the 1840s, 1850s, people in Massachusetts are moving from one place to another at an astonishing rate. They're moving homes more often than people on the frontier are moving. So this new liberty takes hold and really profoundly changes Americans' life. As best I can calculate it, I spent a long time trying. 1 out of 3 Americans moves each year in the 19th century. It's a rate of mobility that I cannot find replicated at any point in human history as an annual ritual of relocation.
How much of that, and I want to come to the fascinating history of zoning, we could spend a couple of hours on that and then move on. But how much of that was negative pressure and how much of that was positive pressure? In other words, how many people were running from a landlord, say, and how many were simply looking for more space? And what other motivations did people have in the 19th century to do this? I mean, you're describing something that's pretty frenetic by our standards. Like most people don't want to move, especially when you leave when you leave your 20s. They don't want to move every year. They don't want to move every other year. What was the underlying causes?
This is actually an answer that has changed pretty recently. Historians used to think that we had what they call the floating proletariat, right? So that the successful people settled down and put down roots and got to stay in their communities. And America in the 19th century was awash with people who had to relocate. And they thought this because they looked at the census records, and they could see the people who stayed where they were did pretty well, and then the other people disappeared. But we've computerized those records now, and we can track the people who are moving. And it turns out that historians had it precisely backward. The movers in any decade from any place outperform the people who stay. They do better in their lives, they jump occupational brackets, they earn more money. Their kids do even better than the kids of the people who stayed. So it's not mostly what relocation had been throughout human history, which was the last resort of the desperate. In the 19th century, Americans are moving because they think they can do a little bit better. And then they move again because they think they can do even better. The Europeans who come over and watch us do this think we're completely nuts. They think that American mobility is evidence of moral failure because we don't love hearth and home. And more than that, evidence of the deep rot in the American psyche that we all think that we can rise above our station. And they write this. Tocqueville comes over and he says, we're restless in the midst of prosperity. He says, how can it be that you have a perfectly good farm and you decide to relocate to someplace else because you think you can have a better farm? Like, what is wrong with these people? Don't they know that they should stay at their assigned station in life and accept their lot? And this really puzzles the Europeans, and the Americans all write about it differently. They say, well, of course we're moving, right? We want something better than what we have, and that's a perfectly natural human impulse. And so you get these two views of it, and that's really what drives people forward. And I know this because you can look at the elite in any decade who are really wigged out by it. They're not saying, wow, the privations are driving people. They're really frustrated that people don't know their place. They won't simply accept their lot, and they keep trying for something better.
This might be a reach, but you're describing an American personality that is restless even in times of prosperity. And I'm wondering if there's some relationship to our political moment right now, which is to say, we have a pretty good economy, we have a pretty good system of government, and yet there's a level of dissatisfaction, some of it's manipulated, some of it's organic, that leads us to throw away things that kind of work. Can you relate this?
Yeah, no, I think that this American restlessness is something like a national character, right? And people think of ourselves as a mobile nation, migratory nation. They use different words for the 19th century. But there is a restlessness. At its best, it's Americans becoming more entrepreneurial than the rest of the world. It's America pushing, striving, and enabling a degree of social mobility that few other nations attain until recent decades. At its worst, it's a casting off of things that actually are pretty valuable, and a kind of a carelessness about preservation that people call out at the time and are worried about.
Okay, tell the history of zoning.
I am
Starting in
glad
Modesto.
that you guys have really comfortable chairs. Yeah, but zoning in America starts in Modesto, California, and you'll find that in other books. It was something I knew. What I didn't know was why. So I spent a long time trying to figure out what had gone on in Modesto, California. The year is 1885. The Chinese are in large numbers in California, including in Modesto, and they've been pushed out of every other occupation. The last thing that is left to them is doing the laundry. Which there is a great need for in California, which is disproportionately male in these years. It's all the guys who have come out seeking gold. They don't want to do laundry because they regard it as women's work. It gets so desperate in a sort of classic San Francisco startup style. Somebody comes up with a solution for this. He gathers people's dirty laundry, he stuffs it in the bags, he puts it on a boat to Hawaii, where there are people who will do the wash. And you can get your laundry back 6 weeks later, right? And he charges an arm and a leg for this. That's not really a great solution, so we'll state that that's walking around in smelly clothing. And the Chinese immigrants move into this niche. The problem is that a laundry is like a coffee shop. Like you don't walk past 4 to get to the 5th one. You just drop your clothes at the nearest one. And so they're moving into neighborhoods to be close to their customers. And the people in Modesto don't like it. And they have solutions for this. Their first solution is arson. They try burning the Chinese out of Modesto. And the Chinese rebuild. Their second solution.
They're also the customers of these laundries, though.
They are, right? This is a very American thing, right? Everyone's dropping their laundry at the Chinese launderer in the morning, and then in the evening, 50 guys put on hoods and march through Chinatown and smash the glass in the windows, beat the people in the streets, right? So yes, you have both sides of this. And that doesn't work either. The Chinese want their piece of the American dream and they won't be scared off. And then they hit on zoning. They write an ordinance which says something new in American law. It says, there's nothing wrong with laundries. This isn't like hurting anyone nearby, but you need to move all your laundries west of the tracks and south of G Street. And I pulled an old map of Modesto, and in the year they write this ordinance, there's only one lot that matches that description, and it bears a label and it says Chinatown. So this was a racial segregation ordinance that creates a Chinese ghetto in Modesto, but it does it with a facially neutral law, and that has always been the brilliance of zoning. You can segregate by class and by race as long as you don't say that's what you're doing.
So take it further. When does it become, when do progressives, or people we would now think of as progressives, realize that you can use zoning to maintain the architectural integrity of an area, or maintain it as a safe place for families as opposed to a helter-skelter distribution of factories, businesses, and homes?
Yeah, so zoning spreads in the early 20th century. The first citywide zoning ordinance we get is in New York. That's a similar story where they're upset that the Jews have come up out of the Lower East Side along Fifth Avenue. They're scaring off the customers of the fancy department stores. And so they petition to push them back down. There's no law that can do that. And so they draft a zoning ordinance aimed at Fifth Avenue, and the politicians realized that's a little bit obvious. You should actually just take the money from the emergence and
What did the ordinance say?
the ordinance was aimed at the garment factories. So they first the garment workers were coming down on lunch break and using the sidewalks, and they were doing it to get a little fresh air because the garment factories were really terrible places. And they were also doing it to look in the department store windows to figure out what they should sew in the afternoon. They could sell their customers. So they couldn't be scared off. They tried rounding them up. They got the New York police to come and cart them all the way in police wagons. And that caused a huge outcry because it was a public sidewalk. These people were walking down a public sidewalk. And that didn't work. And so then they said, what if we limited the heights of buildings and the uses of the buildings so that you couldn't have a garment factory on Fifth Avenue? But there's no law to do that yet. And they asked for that law, and the city says, it's going to look obvious if we just zone Fifth Avenue. Let's zone the whole city. So this is America's first citywide zoning ordinance. And it's going to solve all these problems. It's going to solve poverty. It's going to impose rational order on the chaos of urban life. It's going to separate out functions. They passed this zoning ordinance, and it spreads from there. It spreads because they have to spread it. The guys who write this know what they've done is unconstitutional, and they know that there's a constitutional loophole. A city has something called the police power, which is the power to regulate its citizens. And the standard is, it has to be an ordinary and usual use of the power if it's going to be constitutional. This is not an ordinary use, nobody's ever done this before. But if they can get enough cities to adopt it by the time the case ripens and goes to the Supreme Court, it could retrospectively become an ordinary use. So they evangelize. They try to get cities all over America to adopt this so that it becomes retroactively legal. And they pull it off. By the time the Supreme Court justices walk through Washington, D.C. to get to the Supreme Court building to rule on a case, they're walking through a city that is zoned. And zoning has become a regular use of the police power, and they rule it constitutional.
When was the first time zoning was not used for racist purposes? Okay.
No, so I want to be fair here, right? Zoning is used for lots of good purposes. It's used to protect the environment, it's used to separate out uses. The problem with zoning, as opposed to many other forms of land use regulation, is something that the Supreme Court says when it legitimizes it. It says, look, we're going to use zoning because you can have a pig that's in the parlor and not the barnyard. A perfectly good thing in the wrong place. And so zoning says we'll have different rules for different parts of the city. Instead of saying don't have a terrible use of land that's next to homes, which was the old way of doing it, we'll say you can have that terrible use of land next to those homes, just not over on this side of the tracks. And that is the thing that makes zoning tricky. There's lots of good ways to regulate land, but when you zone, you're basically saying some people get to live in the parlor and some of you are going to live in the barnyard.
All right, let's talk about Jane Jacobs and zoning. And this is obviously something that you've written about extensively in the book, in the Atlantic. Give us the story of how something that I believe you think of as good, possibly even noble, curdles into something very different and leads to the place we are in a lot of different cities.
I can give advice here. If you're writing a book, don't research your heroes. You may not like what you find. Jane Jacobs is utterly brilliant. She writes this terrific book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, at a time when zoning has grown up into a full-fledged urban planning and urban renewal movement, and people are trying to separate out all the functions of city life. She says, wait, that mixing together, that's what makes cities great. People from different walks of life, practicing different trades and occupations, bumping into each other.
I mean, she's precisely making the observation that they didn't make in Modesto, which is, it's fine, it's actually beneficial to have the Chinese laundry next to the deli beneath the apartments, because you have street life and commerce and all the rest, right?
And she's got a laundry next to her house in the West Village, and she writes about how great it is, right? People come in and out. A laundry is actually a terrific neighbor to have. Because there's always customers coming in and out. The launderer is delivering the clothes up and down the block. She loves it. She's right about all of this, and she's right about the more important thing too, which was that the urban renewal movement, which is just knocking neighborhoods down, is a disaster. It has racially disparate effects. It's killing what makes cities vital and vibrant. So she's 100% right in her diagnoses. Her solution to this problem is to empower local communities with what amounts to a distributed veto over the process. so that communities should again be able to determine what happens within their boundaries. This is the seeds of the reversal of what had happened in Ohio 150 years before. We opened up our communities, we said anyone can come live here. And then starting in the 1970s, we started to arm those communities with the power, or really any individual in those communities, with the power to go to court and to challenge any new development, because all new developments now need to be zoned, and we changed the law so that anyone can challenge the government zoning decision. So now anyone with enough time and enough money and enough anger can go to court and indefinitely hold up any development. And that was not something that she really anticipated. But she herself was not living quite the life she wrote about when she buys this townhouse in the West Village. It is the kind of building that she had praised. It had an immigrant family on the top 2 floors who tended the candy store on the bottom floor that all the kids in the neighborhood came and used, and it was a social gathering place. The Jacobses buy this, they rip out the ground floor retail, they turn it into a single family home, they take off the historic facade of the building and put on modern aluminum sash windows, so that when she eventually gets the block landmarked, it's excluded from the historic property designation because there's no historic value left to the building whatsoever. So there's sort of Jacobs the evangelist for historic buildings and for mixed-use retail and vibrant neighborhoods. And there's Jacobs the NIMBY, who changed her own property that way and then landmarks the blocks so that nobody else can develop it, and then develops a new set of legal tools that empower people to do the same throughout America. And those are the 2 sides of her legacy.
Talk about the relationship between this dilemma among progressives, or this hypocrisy among progressives, and the largest problem you're analyzing, the reduction in mobility that leads to the reduction in physical mobility that leads to a reduction in economic and social mobility.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Jacobs is not alone. She is of a generation which sees that things have gone badly wrong in America. That the New Deal, which was supposed to solve things, instead has expanded government power, and many of those agencies have become captured by the businesses they were supposed to regulate. Rachel Carson points this out about the chemical industry and Silent Spring. Ralph Nader points this out about the auto industry and the auto regulators. They're developing a critique which says government is no longer safeguarding the public interest. And their proposed solution is to empower the public to safeguard its own interests by going to court and calling the government to task. It's a doctrine based on the avoidance of harm. So you look around for bad things that are happening in the world and you try to restrain them from happening. The aggregate effect of those changes is to prevent anything from happening. It becomes effectively impossible to build where people most want to live. And this is where we get a great reversal. For 200 years, the richest and poorest places in America were on a convergent path. The gap between them was narrowing. People moved from poorer places to richer places, they improved their prospects and the prospects of their kids. That movement starts to level out in the 1970s, plateaus, and over the last 20 years it's reversed. The gap between the richer and poorer places in America is growing. When people relocate now, they no longer relocate to the places with good jobs and opportunities, to the places that Rod Shetty and his team at Harvard tell us correlate with the best outcomes for their kids. It's the single most important decision you can make as a parent, is where you're going to raise your kids. Like, that's what the data says. It's not how you sleep train them, it's not what books you read them at bedtime, it's where you raise them. And parents knew that, intuited that for a long time, and they moved their kids into these neighborhoods with high opportunities. These days, that's not where families move, they move where the housing is affordable, right? And that is—
They would if they could, but they can't. So they simply look for a house.
Yeah, and many people are just not moving at all. The number of Americans who say they intend to move in the next year and then don't is up by 45% over the same stretch. There's a ton of people out there who want to relocate, who would like to be able to give their families better opportunities, and they're just priced out. And this is just a profound change. The thing that kept America vital and vibrant and pluralistic was the fact that we were constantly moving. We've gone from 1 out of 3 Americans moving every year to 1 in 13.
Talk about the political ramifications of that, even in the last election.
There's this great research on what happens when you move. If you start with a bunch of people who all tell you they intend to move in the next year, and you go back and you talk to them a year later, the ones who have moved get more optimistic. They're more future-oriented. They're making plans about the future. They're more likely to join communal organizations and invest in their communities. They also see other people's success in their community as helping their own success. right? They think that if other people in their community are thriving, that's good for everyone. The ones who wanted to move in couldn't, grew more cynical, more alienated, more detached from their communities, less likely to belong to things. And they start to see the world as a zero-sum game, where somebody else's success, somebody else moving to town and getting something good, that comes at their expense. They grow more hostile to immigration, more hostile to new arrivals. The politics of people actually shifts based on whether or not they're able to exercise mobility. And so if you look around at the 2016 election, we have really good data. It says somebody who never left the town in which they were born was 30 more points likely to vote for Donald Trump. Whereas people who had moved became more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton in that election, right? And you can map the same divide on any two candidates where the politics of issues like immigration, but just generally the orientation, right? Like Donald Trump is brilliant at spotting grievances and exploiting them. And he understood that half the country now feels locked out of the places where they could have the greatest opportunity, locked out of the chance to make a better life for themselves. And even if they don't know it, even if they don't know that the thing they've lost is mobility, because many people don't, they won't put it to you in those terms. What they know is they were supposed to have a sense of agency over their own lives. They were supposed to be able to make their own choices. And instead they feel like they're being acted upon by large impersonal forces that have determined their destiny.
I don't know if this question is poking at a possible contradiction, but I am curious to know why the population of Texas and Florida continually grow, and the Northeast and California lose people. Is this related in any way to what you're talking about? I mean, it seems like people move to Texas because there's some business opportunities, and the relative lack of regulation makes it easier. Is there a housing equivalent?
Yeah, the first time I watched DC deal with snow every summer, every winter, I start thinking about relocating to Florida. So many factors here, right? But the biggest thing is that in red jurisdictions, they have not regulated land in the same way.
That's why Houston looks the way it does.
It does. It's an unzoned city, right? And you may not love Houston, but I will tell you that Houston is a place which is still absorbing enormous numbers of internal migrants and immigrants every year. You can walk down the main streets in Houston and sample pretty much any ethnic cuisine in the world because there's somebody from that country who's living in Houston and has opened a business. There is a happy medium to be achieved, and Houston regulates land in other ways. But those places are growing fast because it's still possible to build there. Population is draining out of blue jurisdictions, costing blue states electoral votes and congressional representation because it's not possible to build there. So the progressive movement has actually slowly eroded its own political power by making it impossible for people to do what they tell us they want. What you can see, if you've ever opened the real estate listings in the Washington Post on a Sunday, there's decent demand for housing in this area, right? The prices are not cheap. People do want to move here, but they can't, and so they're going to move where they can. And if you multiply that story in Washington by all the progressive jurisdictions in the country, what you get is a picture in which the population is moving away from the places where the prices are highest. It doesn't have to be like that, right? These were all cities that grew very, very rapidly for a long, long time.
Just help me square this, and maybe I'm just misunderstanding, but let's say you move from New Jersey or Massachusetts to Texas. You're quite possibly more optimistic about your future because you moved to a new jurisdiction, but you moved to a red jurisdiction and you're, in many cases, entranced by the red politics of Texas. I'm not sure I understand how where maybe there's no circle to...
Yeah, it'll be pretty much a real thing, right? This is the other thing that's driving political polarization in America. There was a book out called The Big Sword, which posited maybe we're polarized because everybody's moving where their politics go. The problem with that thesis is that polarization has happened over the same 50 years where we stopped moving, right? So it doesn't actually work when you go back and you look at the numbers. What's actually driving polarization in America is that we're not moving. The thing that kept us relatively pluralistic was the constant infusion of new people into communities, bearing different life experiences and different ideas. Once that grinds to a halt, we're naturally conformist creatures, and we will tend over time to adopt the politics of the place we live, except for a few people who are like naturally contrarian and will do exactly the opposite of the politics of the place where they live. But most of us are conformist and will over time adopt those views. And political scientists have measured this. It's a really robust effect. If tons of people leave blue states and move to red states, their politics will switch over time. They'll be surrounded by different communities, they'll be paying attention to different issues, absorbing different media, having different conversations at the church social, and their politics will shift. And so this is actually changing the political map of America. That is not, people keep on waiting for these red states to tip blue because so many people are moving from blue states into the red jurisdictions. And we keep seeing the opposite happening, right? It's not actually changing. Texas is not getting bluer. Everyone keeps waiting for that one election where Texas will tip, but that's not how this works. What happens is people move out of the places where they wanted to live, where they couldn't afford to live, and into the places that are still building, their politics shift too.
Right. I want to take questions in a second, but one last question for you is this: what legal or cultural changes would have to take place in cities like this one and the regions like this one in order to increase the possibility that people can move to affordable housing in a place that they think is best for their family or their lives?
Yeah, I mean, we can get into some of the technical legal changes that I think need to be made, but the big one actually is the shifting of the frame. I don't want anyone to build an apartment building next to me. I live in a single family home, I'm very happy in my single family home. I can imagine lots of adverse things, right? Like the construction noise is going to be a pain in the neck, parking will get harder. If I think about that building, I'm going to oppose it. But if you ask me, do I want to live in a community where teachers and nurses and daycare workers and firefighters who serve my community can raise their own kids? Do I want to live in a place that still has room for young families? Do I want to live in a diverse neighborhood? I want all of those things, right? I want new friends and neighbors. I want to live in a low crime neighborhood because there's lots of people walking up and down the street even at night. I want to live in a place that has good retail nearby because there's lots of customers to serve, right? If I start thinking about the people instead of the buildings, then suddenly my frame shifts and I say, yeah, that's a good trade. I'm willing to have that apartment building built next to me because what I'm going to get out of it is lots of things that I value, and I'll be living in a political culture and a community that shares my values, right? So if you shift the conversation away from the harms of new construction and over toward what kind of a country do you want to live in? What kind of a community do you want to build? I think then you have a very different conversation.
But one time, I mean, most of us live in Washington. I mean, the power of the ANCs is enormous. And at least in my experience, it's not as if the ANC, were in the two neighborhoods I lived in Washington primarily, they're interested in this idyllic, nirvana-like American society that you're talking about. They just want fewer cars. And they'll do anything to prevent, including the building of schools, to keep cars out of the neighborhood. It's always been odd to me because you choose to live in a large city and you don't want people. You might want to think about your choices, but that's another subject. But how do you explain, how do you break the power of that kind of local, and you talk about it, the disproportionate power that activists have?
Yeah, and this is, will often rub people the wrong way, but we made a mistake. We devolved back to local communities the power to choose their own members. We said, as long as you don't say you're choosing it one person at a time, you can use proxies, right? You can essentially make development here so expensive that only the wealthy can move in. That's fine. That was a profound mistake. Local communities shouldn't have that power. And giving up power is a really hard thing to do. But it was delegated to them by the states, and the states have the ability to change the rules. There's some really interesting examples here. Japan is a system where there's like a dozen zoning designations, and you can apply any of those labels at the local level, but they're defined nationally, and the most restrictive still allows for multifamily housing and street front retail. You can't go more restrictive than that, right? If you change the rules so that you have simple, clear rules that allow people to build as of right, which is a fancy way of saying you can just build as long as you're following the rules. You don't need to go through an extensive permitting and approval process. There are fewer veto points. So you let people build as of right if they're conforming to these rules. You simplify the rules so the same rules apply across a really broad jurisdiction like the state, and wealthy communities aren't coming up with their own 200 different zoning designations that make it almost impossible to navigate the process. It's a problem that has the power to solve itself because you're not relying on people's good nature, you're relying on the fact that developers want to make money and people want to live where their children will have more opportunity. All you gotta do is take away the restraint, and those forces will naturally let the population.
How do you disempower communities?
At the state level. Because state policymakers can see this as a crisis. They've got
State
budgets.
policymakers all come from neighborhoods.
They do, right? Everybody is really eager to solve the problem in somebody else's neighborhood. So at the state level, you can all solve each other's neighborhood's problems. If you develop it down to the individual level, you lose the fight, 9 times out of 10. And so you can get state level change here, where everybody sort of makes a pact and says, look, and this is where we're actually seeing a lot of the movement in zoning laws right now. It's at the state level, because state legislators can say, okay, my constituents will be a little bit pissed at me and yours will be a little bit pissed at you, but we're gonna level the rules here so that we're all on an equal playing field, we can sell it together. Whereas if you approve one building, what you've done is made all the neighbors of that one building really mad at you at election time. And it's a diffuse good, right? Nobody else is showing up to vote for you because you did it, and lots of people are mad at you because of that one choice. So if you do it battle by battle, you'll never get it through. But if you do it statewide, there is a chance to make a collective decision. The state itself is suffering. It's got a budget gap to close, it's bleeding population. And at the state level, the change is possible.
I want to take some questions. I've seeded the room with hostile questions from Yoni's staff, and I'll just very subtly call on them. But if you raise your hand, there's a mic in the back.
Hello, thanks for the talk. One thing that came to my mind was the issue of urbanization and how a vast majority of Americans are moving to urban centers. And if you ask somebody, if you want to move to some place for economic opportunity, I think a lot of people would answer that they would want to move to a city. So I guess I wonder, when it comes to making America more mobile, does that also come with the risk of weakening more rural communities?
Yeah, this is a great question, right? Because we worry a lot about the places in America that are struggling, shrinking, losing population. The best answer I have for this, and it's a somewhat painful one, is that we should be thinking at the level of individual choice, right? So if you say to somebody, you should have the right to stay in your community and invest in it, that makes sense to me. If you say to somebody, look, I know you want to move someplace else, and I know you've looked at the data and you understand that your kid's going to have much more opportunities and you'll get a better job, but I'm going to give you a really large tax incentive not to make that choice. Or I'll give a business a really large tax incentive to try to persuade you not to make that choice. Suddenly, place-based policy looks a little different, right? To the extent that policymakers try to pick and choose winners among communities, they usually get it wrong. Ohio in 1820 was booming so much that it was competing for residents by changing the law. By 1840, Ohio is the first place in American history to really see a vast emptying out of population. It has a crisis. People are just abandoning their farms. There's new farmland available further to the west that's more fertile and it's bleeding population. By 1890, Cleveland is pretty much the wealthiest city in America. None of that was predictable, right? People in 1820 were betting on Ohio because they thought it was the future. In 1840, they were betting against Ohio because it looked like the past. By the time Rockefeller's creating Standard Oil in Cleveland, it looks like the future again. Cleveland comes down, it goes back up. It's really hard to know in advance which communities will thrive and which won't. I think the best we can do is hope to have policies that give people the chance to make the choices that work for them and their family, even if that sometimes means that, yes, communities will boom and they will bust.
Hi, thanks. A follow-up to that question, I am interested in that response. I think there is this weird tension now around whose individual choice is being supported. I think there's now this idea of the people who are moving can choose themselves, but then the people who are in places that you're being moved into, those individual choices are then moving up out of their individual choices of themselves or the families into a state. So I can choose to move somewhere, but I can't choose to work with my community board to change some of the regulations or other kind of policies to just allow people to pursue their individual choices. And so how do we get at this tension between two different individual choices that are in confliction with each other?
Yeah, it's, you know, there's always a tension between individuals and communities, right? And I think you're right that there's some tension there. But I think at a deeper level, what we're talking about here is letting people move. And when we did that, people could chart a destiny for themselves and make that choice. And it meant ceding some control over other people's lives, right? Often when you're in a conversation with a community board, somebody may stand up and say, this development is going to bring more traffic to my neighborhood. And that is true, right? There are real downsides to development. They may say, look, there's a lot in my neighborhood which has trees on it, and this developer wants to come in and bulldoze those trees. My kids play on that lot, and I'm going to lose that space. That's one of the last undeveloped green spaces in my community. These things are real, but we don't usually give people the right to control other people's lives and their property. And zoning was a shift in that American approach. We said, actually, we're going to let you decide not just what you're going to do with your property, but what your neighbor will do with their property. Not because it's harming you in any way. That was the old standard. If you could demonstrate harm, you could stop them. But now you don't need to demonstrate harm. All you need to do is say, I don't like it. And I think that is a bridge too far, right? Like once we let people veto other people's decisions just because they don't like those decisions, we've tipped the balance a little too far in favor of community. And community is a funny word here because, as I said earlier, when people start moving, that's actually when communities get really vibrant and vital. And in places where mobility has declined, you have lower rates of participation, right? So the irony is, if you back off a little bit on the control, you can actually revitalize the underlying community.
There's a totally counter.
We actually know things.
I'll just shout.
There's a totally counter theory of politics here, which is that people should have the economic liberty to not move, to stay where they grew up, and that the idea that people should move to opportunity is somehow elitist or snooty. And that makes me wonder, what's up with that? And is the big picture trend that you're describing in the book of a shift from a highly mobile culture to a not mobile culture, is there variation when you look at class and wealth levels? So that's, like, how evenly distributed is that transition? Is it in fact sort of snooty and elitist? Is it a privileged thing to do at this point to move around a lot?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The people in America who still have the opportunity to move are the people with high levels of education and income. They've remained pretty mobile. It's always interesting to me when somebody makes, because I get this a lot, right? People say, you're just a coastal elitist, you don't understand the importance of tight-knit communities. That was not an American perspective for 200 years, right? Like, the typical American was moving a lot, and their communities were tight-knit because they had these high levels of mobility, so people arriving in a new town would invest in their community, belong to voluntary associations, show up in church. All of that has declined over the last 50 years at precisely the same time our mobility has declined and in the same places. And so, somehow we've inverted our logic here. The other thing to say, though, is that when we had a really high rate of mobility, the cool thing about it is it makes everything an active choice and an exercise of agency. Moving becomes an act of agency. So does staying in place. There's lots of good reasons to stay where you are. I have never in my life, I've moved a lot in my life, and I've never wanted to. There have always been really good countervailing reasons not to move. Friends, family, things that I am deeply invested in and care about. There's always that reason not to move. And that's fine, right? Like, I don't think anyone should have to move if they don't want to. And once you've restored the possibility of mobility, you are also restoring the choice not to move. And that choice, as an active choice, becomes a choice to invest in your community, to stay in your community. You can stay where you are and feel equally empowered. And I think you probably, we'd have to run the experiment at the national level, but I think you probably get a lot of the benefits of mobility from people who stay at that point. Because part of what really drives the cynicism and the disconnection is the sense of disempowerment. So if we restore mobility, it not only gives people the chance to start moving again, it also allows the people who want to stay where they are and want to retain the benefits of being where they are, a sense of agency and control, and the dignity of choice. And so I think you can get both sides of it then, But first you've got to reopen the possibility, moving to the vast majority of the American population, which really doesn't exercise that choice as it must do.
So, there's been a lot of renewed interest, in the work of Robert Putnam and, the notion of social capital. And, if you look at the trend, of localities around the world, you see that similar patterns of erosion of social capital, cohesion, trust. The trust barometer showed this year some of the lowest levels of social trust between people, trust in governments, trust in institutions, and it's happening everywhere. So this is telling a very exceptional and unique American story, but you're seeing this pattern of breakdown of trust everywhere for different reasons. So how much of it do you yourself attribute to this issue of the unique phenomenon of movement in America versus other things that are intrinsic to community?
Yeah, so the right to live where you want is, in legal terms, an American invention. But like other American liberties, it spreads, right? And you get very high rates of mobility in other countries subsequently. And in those countries where you have, Putnam's original work is on Italy, right? And one of his observations is that in southern Italy, he doesn't put it in these terms, but southern Italy has really low rates of social capital and a highly sedentary population. In northern Italy, which has already emptied out the countryside into the industrial cities, you see incredibly high rates of civic organizational life. Like that's his original foundational finding. I would reframe it in terms of mobility. I would say that in many of the cultures that you're looking at, there was a burst of mobility around industrialization, urbanization. It gave these societies, which had long been relatively sedentary and stagnant, a burst of social capital formation, of civic life. By 1920, Europeans are no longer coming to America and being like, what's with all the clubs? They have them back in Europe, right? So Europe takes a while to catch up, and then has suffered some of the same kinds of forces that we're seeing in the States, where you talk to somebody in Britain, really hard to build in Britain. They've got their own affordable housing crisis that stems from the same kinds of local control that we innovate that, again, spread abroad. In those places, you can find similar splits between a highly sedentary, relatively urban and exurban areas, rural and exurban areas, which have tended politically conservative in recent years and toward politics of grievance, as opposed to the cities where better educated and more affluent populations remain highly mobile and remain more optimistic, future-oriented, and more accepting and trusting. So I think that you're right that there is something, I may be exaggerating the exceptional extent of the American story, but only because having innovated this stuff, we then spread it. And I think you can tell versions of the same story in many other countries.
Where are they doing it right from your perspective? You get to define what right is, but where are they doing it right? Where's the balance?
I am fascinated by Tokyo, which was going down the same path as New York from the 1970s until about 2000. Right? Property prices are going up, it's got a lot of local control, it's worried about the impact on the environment, and then it shifts, it's a national level shift. Again, it's the same kind of story where it's tough to do things at the local level, but because zoning in Japan is federal, they redefine the national zoning categories and make it so that you can build that spread more easily, that the categories are less restricted. It has stayed comparatively affordable. But you get lots of other benefits from this too, right? So you get workshops where people can have in a residential neighborhood a purse factory or something like that, because it's not zoned out. And so these are places where the housing remains relatively cheap. There's a lot of economic opportunity. There's more entrepreneurial activity, and there's really vibrant communities.
Would Japan be the same story if it were not almost entirely racially homogenous?
It's a great question, right? Because in America, if you want to know what populations we really hate, look at whose mobility we've restricted and when, right? Like there's a consistent story in America with the restriction of mobility. And yeah, maybe we can't pull this off. Maybe our racial divisions and discriminations make it too hard to open our neighborhoods to people of diverse backgrounds, and we will always rest on exclusionary tools. I don't want to believe that. I think that for a long time, despite the pushback, and by pushback I mean violence that integrated communities brought, we kept pushing ahead of it, right? Like there is a broad arc that I can tell for the first 200 years of the nation's existence were with ups and downs, right? And with retrograde movement during periods like redemption. But the overall arc was toward more integration of populations, toward greater mobility for more people, until we start changing the rules. And over the last 50 years, that's not the story I would tell, right? I would say that we're becoming more economically segregated, more politically polarized, and that racial desegregation has not gone on the trajectory that everybody thought it was all on during the civil rights era, right? We have not succeeded in integrating our neighborhoods. We're doing it at the high end. Among the professional classes where mobility remains readily available, we've continued to integrate high-end neighborhoods racially and ethnically. But among people who are lower on the income stratum, right, anywhere from like the 80th percentile down, you'll find less racial integration in neighborhoods. So, maybe that's just our destiny, but I'd like to think that we had this right for a long time and we could change the rules and get back to it.
We have time for, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just
Oh,
having.
wait for a mic. Oh, did you want to go? No, have her.
Mine's pretty fast.
Okay, go ahead, Reggie.
So you described how right now so many Americans are moving from blue northern cities toward the more red southern cities, and you said the primary reason for that is zoning. Do you think that those zoning differences will kind of set the tone for the future of American domestic migration, or will the cities in the South change their policies as their populations change?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as southern cities have grown, we've seen some change in terms of housing restriction. Sometimes development does do that. I was talking earlier this week to a reporter in North Carolina who was interested in the book because he's covering lots of legislative actions there in North Carolina, both at the local and state level that are intended to restrict further development from communities that are worried about overdevelopment. Right? So you may see some of that happen. I think the more likely change is a generational change in northern cities though. Not just northern cities, but cities throughout the country tend to be blue, right? You'd have to look go pretty far down the list before you start finding cities that are governed by Republican mayors at the moment. But even whether it's a blue city in a red state or a blue city in a blue state, there's a sharp generational split. If you go to a zoning hearing, you'll hear one generation get up and talk about the environmental impact of the development. And the younger generations that get up and testify start talking about global warming and about the need for dense development. They conceive of adding housing to their community as helping rather than the growth hurting. And I think the politics tend to change on a generational basis. It's very hard to get people to change their minds, but you get generational succession and among younger voters, they're much more worried about those issues, right? To the extent they're worried about the environment, they're worried about climate. To the extent that they're worried about affordability, they're worried about producing enough. And as the politics of this shift in those blue jurisdictions, I would expect policies to shift too.
I'm so sorry if this is redundant, and I'm just having such a hard time teasing out the rural versus the urban and the economic factors that go with that. So I understand all of the zoning for cities and how that's keeping people from being mobile one way or the other. But when you look at it in larger political terms and what's happening in the smaller rural areas, does zoning affect that? I mean, do you see in your data people trying to move to those cities where they don't, and if they want to move, it seems like they want to move to the city and they don't want to invest in that community. Is that also because of the zoning, or is there a larger, and how did you tease out the mobility from the economic issues that are happening there?
Yeah, these are really complicated questions, and there is no, we can't run random controlled trials on random American citizens in rural areas, right? Like, you'll never get that past the IRB. So the best we have is inference. And when you look at rural areas, there are two things that have really changed in the last 50 years. One is people from those areas used to move toward opportunity. Sometimes that was to another rural area, right? Like you might, North Dakota for a while was having a shale boom and people moved, right? So it's not that they're necessarily moving to urban areas in pursuit of opportunity, but wherever they were moving, they could do better by moving than they could by staying. we've reversed that calculus for many people from rural areas. There's a great study which shows that, like, if you were a janitor in Alabama and you moved to San Francisco 50 years ago, you earn so much more in San Francisco, it takes care of your costs. These days, if you make that same move, you end up behind. And so people are no longer leaving the rural areas in pursuit of opportunity because they can't afford. They'll end up worse off for doing that. And it has another effect too. It's created a labor glut in some of those rural areas. There are more people than there are jobs. So when people moved from low opportunity areas to high opportunity areas, it had like multiple good effects. One is what we think of in international terms as remittances, right? So they'd get a good job someplace where the economy is growing and they'd send money back into the community that they came from. We know that has tremendous development effects in international terms. The same thing was true in domestic terms. The second thing it did was it was really good for the people who moved and for their kids who got a lot of opportunity. And the third thing it did was it tightened the labor market back home. And you can watch over time as rural American communities, even as they were losing population, could gain economically because that tighter labor market drove up wages, and even in the face of automation, you could still support good paying jobs in those communities. As the population has stagnated, those gains are no longer as visible in the data. So there are many ways in which the constriction of mobility by zoning in the places where there is opportunity hurts the greatest impact. I think this is really, and it's a hard thing to see because you can't actually see it with your own eyes. The worst effect of not putting that new apartment building on your block is the guy living in rural Nebraska who is going to move here to take a good job and to raise his kid and send her to your school, who can't move there anymore, right? And you don't even know that he existed. You've never thought about him for a moment. The people who testified against the building weren't thinking about this guy, they weren't thinking about his daughter. But that's the person who lost out. And they lost a whole life. And the people on the block gained a little less construction noise. But it's really hard to see because you have to imagine it. It's not visible the way that the bulldozer is visible.
Yoni, it's fantastic. We're gonna have some signing, right, Brad? We're gonna sign. It's a fantastic book. You should read it. More importantly, you should buy it. And I want to thank all of you for your excellent questions. And Yoni, thank you for writing such an important book. And thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting us.
Copies of Yoni's book are available at the checkout desk. He'll be over in that corner signing. And our staff would appreciate it if you would fold up these chairs. If you're having trouble folding them up, because there's a trick to them, just ask one of us. Thanks again for coming.